Nobody wanted the job. $80,000 a year to drive a car that hadn't left the garage in 3 years. The application sat in the employment office for 6 months before Ethan Reed, a broke single father with calloused hands and desperate eyes, finally picked it up. The mansion behind the iron gates looked like something from a Gothic novel. Windows dark as secrets, ivy crawling up the walls like forgotten memories. When the butler opened the door, his face carried the weight of unspoken warnings. Ethan clutched his crumpled resume, rain dripping from his worn navy jacket onto polished marble floors. The silence stretched between them like a question neither dared to ask. "She's been waiting," the old man whispered, though his eyes suggested Ethan might not be ready for what he'd find. "But I wonder if you understand what waiting really costs." 3 years had passed since the accident that shattered Ethan's world into pieces too sharp to hold. Sarah's laughter still echoed in empty rooms of their small rental house, where 10-year-old Grace moved through her days like a ghost, learning to be human again. The veterinary clinic where Ethan had once healed broken wings and mended torn hearts had closed its doors when the medical bills consumed everything they'd built together. Now Grace sat at the kitchen table each morning, stirring cereal she wouldn't eat, her art supplies gathering dust in a box marked "Mom's Things." The eviction notice on their refrigerator bore yesterday's date, and Ethan's checking account showed $17.32. The job posting had appeared almost supernatural in its timing. Private driver needed for distinguished client in Mystic, Connecticut. Discretion essential. Previous applicants unsuccessful. Ethan had driven through Mystic countless times, admiring the historic seaport town where old money built mansions like monuments to their own permanence. The Whitmore estate sat on 12 acres of pristine waterfront property, its Victorian architecture commanding respect from behind wrought iron gates that hadn't opened for deliveries in 3 years. Local whispers spoke of Margaret Whitmore, the real estate mogul who owned 40% of the town's commercial district. But whispers also carried darker truths about a woman who hadn't been seen in public since her son's funeral. James Crawford, the estate's butler, led Ethan through corridors lined with oil paintings that seemed to watch their passage. The man's silver hair was perfectly groomed, his black suit pressed to military precision, but his hands trembled slightly as he opened the garage door. Inside sat a pristine black Bentley Continental, its leather interior unmarked by human touch, its odometer reading exactly 3,712 miles. "Mrs. Whitmore requires transportation to various appointments," James explained, his voice carrying the weight of practiced formality. "You'll receive your schedule each morning. Payment is deposited weekly." He paused at the driver's side door, running weathered fingers along the chrome. "She hasn't spoken to anyone new in quite some time. Don't take her silence personally." The first week passed in a symphony of unspoken communication. Each morning, Ethan found a handwritten note on elegant stationery detailing the day's destinations. First National Bank, Morrison & Associates Law Firm, Mystic Medical Center. Margaret Whitmore emerged from the estate's side entrance precisely at the appointed time. Her silver hair pulled into a severe chignon, her black clothing expensive but deliberately unremarkable. Dark sunglasses concealed her eyes even on cloudy days, and she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd forgotten how to be spontaneous. She never looked directly at Ethan, communicating only through the intercom system that separated the front and rear compartments of the Bentley. But Ethan noticed things, the way she paused before entering the car, as if gathering courage for a simple journey, how her hands shook when she thought no one was watching, fingers worrying the edges of a leather portfolio that never left her side. She never went inside any of the buildings they visited. Instead, she had Ethan wait while assistants brought documents to the car window. During their third trip to the cemetery on Elm Grove Road, Ethan glimpsed her reflection in the rearview mirror as she stood before a modest granite headstone her composure finally cracking like ice in spring rain. She stood there for exactly 17 minutes, her shoulders rising and falling with the effort of breathing. The breakthrough came during their second week, when Grace's school called about a parent conference. Ethan explained to James that he'd need to arrive 15 minutes late for their afternoon appointment. When he finally pulled up to the estate, Margaret Whitmore was waiting by the car, but her usual rigid posture had softened into something resembling curiosity. "Family emergency?" she asked through the intercom, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised them both. "My daughter's teacher wanted to discuss her adjustment issues," Ethan replied, adjusting the rearview mirror. "She hasn't been the same since her mother passed." The silence that followed felt different somehow, charged with recognition rather than discomfort. "Children process grief differently than adults," Margaret said, as they drove toward downtown Mystic. Her voice had lost its careful modulation, becoming almost conversational. "Sometimes they need permission to feel their pain instead of protecting everyone else from it." Ethan found himself sharing details he'd kept locked away: how Grace had stopped drawing, how she apologized for everything, how she seemed to be shrinking into herself despite his efforts to draw her back into the world. "Art was her language before," he said, stopping at a red light near the town square. "Now she acts like it hurts to hold a pencil." Margaret was quiet for several blocks before asking him to stop at Coastal Art Supplies, where she emerged 20 minutes later, carrying a large bag she placed carefully on the seat beside her. That evening, Ethan found an expensive set of watercolor paints on his front doorstep, accompanied by a note written in Margaret's precise handwriting. "For Grace. Sometimes we need new tools to rebuild what we've lost." Grace held the paints like they might disappear if she breathed too hard, her fingers tracing the pristine tubes of cerulean blue and cadmium yellow. "She must be very nice," Grace whispered, setting up her easel for the first time in months. "I think she might understand about missing people." Ethan watched his daughter create her first painting since the accident. A simple cottage surrounded by a garden where impossible flowers bloomed in every color of the spectrum. Their relationship shifted imperceptibly over the following weeks, like a river changing course so gradually that the new path felt inevitable. Margaret began requesting longer routes to their destinations, asking Ethan about his background as they drove through Mystic's tree-lined neighborhoods. She learned about his veterinary training, his abandoned dreams of becoming a sculptor before practical concerns led him toward a more stable career. "I used to work with clay," he admitted one afternoon as they passed the local community center where art classes were held. "Made some pieces I was proud of before life got complicated." Margaret studied his profile in the rearview mirror, noting the way his hands gripped the steering wheel with the careful precision of someone who understood how to shape things into beauty. "There's a pottery studio in the estate's basement," she said quietly. "It hasn't been used in several years, but everything's still there." She directed him to park near the estate's rear entrance, leading him down stone steps into a room that seemed frozen in time. Pottery wheels sat covered in dust sheets, shelves lined with unfired pieces in various stages of completion. The air smelled of clay and creative possibility, with afternoon sunlight filtering through small windows set high in the stone walls. "My son Michael worked here," Margaret explained, her voice catching slightly on his name. "He had talent. Real talent." She picked up a partially completed bowl, its edges rough but promising, her fingers tracing the places where other hands had shaped the clay with hope and intention. Ethan found himself spending lunch breaks in the studio, gradually cleaning and organizing the space. Margaret never asked him to do this work, but she began appearing in the doorway during his sessions, watching silently as he tested the equipment and sorted through supplies. The pottery wheel hummed to life under his touch like an old friend returning from a long journey. Clay felt familiar beneath his fingers, responsive and forgiving in ways that life rarely was. Margaret brought him coffee without being asked, setting the cups on a nearby table and settling into a worn armchair that had clearly been placed there for observation. "You work like someone who understands patience," she observed one afternoon, watching him center a lump of clay with practiced ease. Their conversations in the car became more frequent and less careful. Margaret shared fragments of her life, the loneliness of success, the weight of making decisions that affected entire communities, the hollow feeling of returning to an empty house that echoed with memories of laughter. Ethan learned that she'd built her real estate empire from nothing, purchasing properties that others considered worthless and transforming them into profitable ventures. "I used to think I was creating something meaningful," she said during a drive to the Harbor District, where construction crews worked on her latest development project. "Now I wonder if I've just been good at destroying other people's dreams to build my own." The revelation came by accident, as many truths do. Margaret had left her purse in the car during a brief stop at the pharmacy, and when it slipped from the seat, its contents scattered across the floor. Ethan gathered the items carefully, but not before seeing the photographs that had fallen face up near his feet. A young man with dark hair and Margaret's thoughtful eyes smiled from a college graduation photo, his cap slightly askew, his arm around a woman who must have been his girlfriend. "Michael," Margaret said quietly when she returned, noting Ethan's careful silence. "He would have been 22 next month." She took the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, studying the image as if memorizing details she feared forgetting. "It was studying environmental science at Yale," she continued as they drove through downtown Mystic. "Wanted to find ways to develop land without destroying ecosystems. He used to argue with me about my projects, saying I was prioritizing profit over people." Her voice carried a mixture of pride and regret that Ethan recognized from his own memories of Sarah. The pottery was his way of staying grounded, he said, creating something beautiful instead of just profitable. She was quiet for several blocks before adding, "He died 3 years ago, overdose. I found him in the studio that morning, sitting at the wheel, with a half-finished piece still spinning." The weight of her confession settled between them like a living thing. Ethan understood now why the job had remained unfilled, why Margaret rarely left the estate, why she moved through the world like someone afraid of disturbing the careful balance that kept her functioning. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "Losing a child, there aren't words for that kind of pain." Margaret nodded slowly, removing her sunglasses for the first time since he'd known her. Her eyes were the same blue-green as the harbor on clear days, but rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. "He was trying to get clean," she whispered. "I thought giving him space to work on his art would help. Instead, I gave him space to die alone." Ethan began bringing Grace to the estate on Saturday afternoons, initially just to show her the pottery studio. Margaret watched from her office window as Grace explored the space with the careful wonder of someone discovering hidden treasure. The girl's paintings had grown more complex since receiving the watercolors, filled with symbolic representations of loss and hope that surprised the adults who viewed them. "She's processing," Margaret observed as Grace arranged her art supplies on one of the studio tables. "Children often understand healing better than we do." Grace seemed naturally drawn to Margaret, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone else who moved carefully through a world that had proven unpredictable and sometimes cruel. The three of them fell into an easy rhythm during these weekend sessions. Margaret would sit in her armchair, reading or working on estate business, while Ethan threw pottery and Grace painted at her makeshift easel. Conversations flowed naturally in this creative environment, touching on everything from Grace's school projects to Margaret's memories of Michael's childhood. Grace showed no fear of Margaret's reputation or wealth, treating her with the straightforward honesty that children offer to adults they trust. "Do you miss your son every day?" Grace asked one afternoon, her brush poised over a canvas depicting a garden where real and imaginary flowers grew side by side. "Every moment," Margaret replied without hesitation. "But being here with you and your father helps me remember the good parts, too." She pointed to one of Michael's unfinished pieces on a nearby shelf. "He would have liked you, Grace. He always said that real artists see the world differently than other people." Grace considered this seriously before dipping her brush in violet paint. "My mom used to say that sad colors make happy colors look brighter," she said, adding purple shadows to her painted flowers. "Maybe that's why we need both kinds of feelings." Margaret and Ethan exchanged glances over Grace's head, both struck by the wisdom that children sometimes offered without realizing its depth. But their peaceful routine shattered on a gray October morning, when Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on Ethan's door with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The elderly woman had lived in her small house on Maple Street for 37 years, raising 6 children and countless grandchildren within its walls, painted the color of sunshine. Now she held an eviction notice bearing the Whitmore Real Estate logo, her hands shaking as she tried to explain that she couldn't afford the increased rent that would take effect at month's end. "I don't understand," she whispered in broken English. "I always pay on time. This is my home." Grace stood behind Ethan in her pajamas, her eyes wide with the recognition that sometimes the adults couldn't fix everything that went wrong in the world. Ethan stared at the official letterhead, feeling something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized Margaret's signature at the bottom of the notice. The woman who had shown such gentleness toward his daughter, who had shared her own pain with careful honesty, was the same person who seemed determined to displace families from their homes for the sake of profit margins. "There must be some mistake," he heard himself saying, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head sadly, producing additional notices from other families in their neighborhood. Apparently, Margaret's latest development project required the demolition of 12 houses on Maple Street, and the residents had 30 days to find alternative housing in a market where affordable options were scarce as honesty in politics. The confrontation came that afternoon, when Ethan arrived at the estate to find Margaret waiting by the car with her usual composed expression. He said nothing during their drive to the bank, but his silence carried a different quality than their comfortable quiet of previous weeks. Margaret seemed to sense the change, glancing at his reflection in the rearview mirror with growing concern. When they returned to the estate, Ethan didn't immediately open her door as he usually did. Instead, he sat behind the wheel, gripping it so tightly his knuckles showed white against his skin. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice carrying a hardness that made Margaret flinch despite herself. They faced each other in the pottery studio, surrounded by the evidence of their growing friendship and the fragile trust they'd built over weeks of shared confidences. Ethan placed Mrs. Rodriguez's eviction notice on the table between them, the official paper looking obscene among Grace's cheerful paintings and Michael's unfinished pottery. 37 years, Ethan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She's lived in that house for 37 years, raised her family there, buried her husband from that front porch. And you're throwing her out so you can build, what, another strip mall? More luxury condos that locals can't afford?" Margaret stared at the notice as if seeing it for the first time, her face pale but her chin raised in defensive defiance. "You don't understand how business works," Margaret replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "These properties have been undervalued for years. I'm creating jobs, bringing investment to the community." Ethan laughed bitterly, gesturing toward the photographs of Michael that decorated the studio walls. "Is this why your son argued with you? Because you convinced yourself that destroying people's lives was actually helping them?" Margaret's composure cracked at the mention of Michael, her carefully maintained mask slipping to reveal the raw pain beneath. "Don't you dare bring Michael into this," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed to build something lasting. What you've built is a monument to your own greed." Ethan shot back, moving toward the pottery wheel where he'd spent so many peaceful hours. "You take what other people love and turn it into profit, just like you did with this studio after Michael died. You locked it away because it reminded you of your failures as a mother." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy, and Margaret stepped backward as if physically struck. Her hands found the edge of a work table, gripping it for support as tears she'd held back for 3 years finally broke free. "He hated me," she whispered, her voice broken and raw. "Michael died hating everything I'd become." "Maybe he had good reason," Ethan said, immediately regretting the cruelty of his words but unable to stop the flood of anger and disappointment. Margaret's face hardened at his response, her tears stopping as abruptly as they'd started. She moved to a shelf where Michael's pottery sat in various stages of completion, selecting a delicate bowl that bore the marks of her son's careful fingers. Without warning, she raised it above her head and hurled it toward the floor, where it exploded into fragments that scattered across the stone like broken promises. "There," she said, her voice steady and cold. "Now it matches everything else in my life." Ethan left the estate that afternoon, carrying his personal tools and the weight of shattered expectations. Margaret stood at her office window, watching his truck disappear through the iron gates that would close behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. The pottery studio felt different now, haunted by harsh words and broken trust, the fragments of Michael's bowl still scattered where they'd fallen. Grace cried when Ethan explained that they wouldn't be visiting the estate anymore, her paintings seeming to lose their vibrant colors as she processed another loss in her young life. "Did we do something wrong?" she asked, clutching the watercolor set that Margaret had given her. "Sometimes adults make mistakes that hurt everyone around them," Ethan replied, holding his daughter close and wondering if he was talking about Margaret or himself. The weeks that followed passed in a haze of job applications and mounting bills. Ethan found temporary work at a local garage, his artistic hands growing rough again from manual labor that paid barely enough to cover their basic expenses. Grace's art teacher called to express concern about the girl's increasingly dark paintings, images of withered gardens and empty houses that reflected her internal landscape. Mrs. Rodriguez moved in with her daughter's family across town, leaving behind the garden she'd tended for 4 decades and the neighbors who'd become her chosen family. The demolition of Maple Street began on a Tuesday morning, heavy machinery arriving before dawn to erase decades of memories with mechanical efficiency. Margaret retreated deeper into the estate's protective walls, venturing out only for essential appointments and returning to the self-imposed isolation that had defined her existence before Ethan's arrival. James noticed that she'd stopped eating regular meals, surviving on coffee and the kind of determination that eventually consumed itself. The pottery studio remained untouched, its door locked and its windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked out the light. Margaret would sometimes stand outside the door for long minutes, her hand on the brass knob, but she never found the courage to step inside and face the evidence of everything she'd lost. Grace's accident happened on a Thursday afternoon when October rain made the streets slick with fallen leaves and automotive regret. She had been riding her bicycle to her friend Emma's house, pedaling hard against the wind, when a car ran a stop sign at the intersection of Harbor and Main Streets. The impact sent her small body flying through the air before she landed hard against the concrete curb, her left arm bent at an angle that made witnesses gasp and call for ambulances. Ethan received the call while changing oil in a customer's sedan, his hands still black with grease as he raced through downtown Mystic toward the hospital where his daughter lay unconscious and fragile as spun glass. The emergency room at Lawrence Memorial Hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear, its fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh relief. Grace's arm required surgery to repair multiple fractures, a procedure that would cost $8,000, even with the basic insurance coverage that Ethan barely managed to afford. He sat in the surgical waiting room with his head in his hands, calculating and recalculating numbers that refused to add up to anything resembling hope. The receptionist had been polite but firm about the hospital's payment requirements, and Ethan faced the terrible possibility that his inability to pay might affect the quality of care his daughter received. Margaret appeared in the waiting room like a vision from a dream he'd forgotten having. She wore a simple black coat over dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the composed businesswoman he'd known. She moved through the hospital corridors with purpose, speaking quietly to nurses and administrators with an authority that came from decades of making things happen through sheer force of will. When she finally approached Ethan, her face carried an expression he couldn't quite read, part determination, part something that might have been fear. "Grace's surgery has been taken care of," she said without preamble, settling into the plastic chair beside him. "The best orthopedic surgeon in Connecticut is flying in from Hartford. She'll have physical therapy for as long as she needs it, and there won't be any bills." Ethan stared at her in confusion, his exhausted mind struggling to process this unexpected development. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Why would you, after everything that happened between us?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she chose her words with the precision of someone who'd learned that careless speech could wound beyond repair. "Because I know something about you that you don't know about me," she said finally, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her words. "Your wife Sarah died on Riverside Drive 3 years ago, when her car hit a tree during that ice storm in February. The road had no lighting because I'd been fighting the city council's proposal to install streetlights there. I thought it would decrease my property values in that area." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face as Margaret's words penetrated his consciousness like cold water filling his lungs. The police report said she lost control on a curve, but what it didn't say was that proper lighting might have helped her see the ice in time to slow down. The waiting room seemed to tilt around Ethan as he processed this revelation. Sarah's accident had happened on a dark stretch of road that he'd always considered dangerous, but he'd never thought to investigate why the city hadn't addressed the obvious safety concerns. "You knew," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hospital's ambient noise. "You knew who I was when you hired me." Margaret nodded slowly, tears beginning to track down her cheeks as she faced the weight of her confession. "I've known since the day you applied for the job. James ran a background check, and when I saw Sarah's name and the accident report, I realized that my greed had taken your wife away from you. That's why you hired me," Ethan said, understanding flooding through him like a fever breaking. "Not because you needed a driver, but because you felt guilty." Margaret's silence confirmed his suspicions, and he felt something sharp and painful twist in his chest as he realized that their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of hidden guilt and deception. "Michael found out about the accident," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger despite her tears. "I'd been fighting the lighting proposal for 6 months when Sarah died, and he did the research to understand why. He was the one who showed me her obituary, who made me understand that my business decisions had real consequences for real people." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place in Ethan's mind as Margaret spoke. "That's why he started using again," he said, more statement than question. "He couldn't live with knowing that his mother had blood on her hands." Margaret nodded miserably, her composed facade finally crumbling completely as she faced the full weight of her actions. He'd been clean for 8 months before he learned about Sarah. After that, he said he couldn't stand to look at me, couldn't bear to live in a house built on other people's misery. The overdose happened just 2 months later. She looked up at Ethan with eyes that held 3 years of self-recrimination and sleepless nights, filled with might-have-beens. A doctor emerged from the surgical suite before Ethan could formulate a response to Margaret's devastating revelations. Grace's surgery had been successful, though she would need several weeks of recovery time and extensive physical therapy to regain full use of her arm. As they walked toward her room, Ethan felt caught between anger at Margaret's deception and gratitude for her intervention on Grace's behalf. His daughter lay small and pale against white hospital sheets, her left arm encased in a cast decorated with stickers that some thoughtful nurse had provided. When she opened her eyes and saw both Ethan and Margaret standing beside her bed, she smiled with the uncomplicated joy of a child who trusted that the adults in her life would always protect her. "Mrs. Margaret," Grace said softly, her voice still thick from anesthesia. "Did you come to visit me?" Margaret approached the bed carefully, as if Grace might disappear if she moved too quickly. "I came to make sure you're going to be okay," she replied, smoothing Grace's hair with a gentleness that contradicted her reputation as a ruthless businesswoman. Grace studied Margaret's face with the serious attention that children gave to important matters. "Are you going to be okay too?" she asked. "You look like you've been crying." Margaret glanced at Ethan before answering, her expression asking for permission to be honest with his daughter about adult complications that children shouldn't have to understand. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt people they care about," Margaret said carefully. "When that happens, we have to figure out how to make things right again, even when it's very difficult." Grace nodded solemnly, processing this information with the same intensity she brought to her artwork. "My mom used to say that broken things could be fixed to be even more beautiful than before," she said, remembering Sarah's encouragement during one of her childhood art projects. "Maybe that's true for people, too." Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears at Grace's innocent wisdom, and she had to turn away from the bed to compose herself. That evening, while Grace slept under the influence of pain medication and the security of knowing she was loved, Ethan and Margaret sat in the hospital cafeteria drinking coffee that tasted like liquid cardboard. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd shared before, stripped of pretense and politeness as they faced the complicated truth of their connection. Margaret explained how she'd spent 3 years researching every family affected by her business decisions, how she'd tried to find ways to make amends without revealing her involvement in their tragedies. Hiring Ethan had been partly selfish, a way to ease her guilt by helping the family she'd hurt most directly. "I never intended for us to become friends," she admitted, staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she'd never learned to ask. "I thought I'd provide you with a good job and eventually find a way to make larger reparations without having to face your hatred directly." She looked up at Ethan with something approaching hope in her eyes. "But spending time with you and Grace showed me what I'd been missing by hiding from the world. You both reminded me that life is meant to be lived with other people, not just endured in isolation." Ethan found himself remembering the quiet contentment of their Saturday afternoons in the pottery studio, how natural it had felt to share space and conversation with someone who understood grief from the inside. "The eviction notices," Ethan said, bringing up the issue that had destroyed their fragile trust. "You could stop them, call off the whole development project." Margaret nodded slowly, pulling a folded document from her purse and sliding it across the table toward him. "I already have," she said. "Mrs. Rodriguez and the other families will receive notices tomorrow that their leases have been extended indefinitely at current rates. The development project has been canceled." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I am also establishing a foundation that will provide low-interest loans to families facing housing displacement throughout Connecticut. It won't undo the damage I've caused over the years, but it's a start." The next morning brought autumn sunshine through Grace's hospital window and news that she could go home the following day. Margaret arrived with a wheelchair decorated with ribbons and a stuffed elephant that she claimed had been waiting in the gift shop for just the right person to adopt it. Grace named the elephant Charlotte and insisted that it needed to see the pottery studio as soon as she was well enough to visit the estate again. Charlotte is an artist too, Grace explained seriously. She makes sculptures with her trunk, but they're invisible so only other elephants can see them. Margaret and Ethan exchanged glances over Grace's head, both amazed by the child's ability to find magic in the midst of pain and uncertainty. During Grace's recovery, Ethan found himself returning to the estate not as an employee but as something harder to define. Margaret had unlocked the pottery studio and spent hours there alone, sweeping up the fragments of Michael's broken bowl and arranging them on a work table like pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. When Ethan finally joined her there, she was holding a tube of gold paint and staring at the pottery shards with the intensity of someone trying to see the future in tea leaves. "I researched that Japanese technique you mentioned," she said without looking up. "Kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold so the repair becomes part of the beauty." They worked together in comfortable silence, carefully applying gold paint to the cracks where Michael's bowl had shattered. The process required patience and precision, qualities that both of them had learned through loss and disappointment. As the golden veins took shape across the ceramic surface, the bowl began to look less like something broken and more like something transformed by its own destruction. "Michael would have liked this," Margaret said softly, holding up a piece to catch the light streaming through the basement windows. "He always said that the most beautiful things were the ones that had survived being damaged." Grace returned to the estate on a Saturday afternoon in late November, her arm still in a cast but her spirit restored to something approaching its former brightness. She immediately set up her easel near the pottery wheel where Ethan was working and began painting a scene that made both adults stop their work to watch. Her painting showed three figures working together in a basement studio, their faces turned toward windows where golden light streamed in like hope made visible. In the foreground sat a pottery bowl, decorated with golden cracks that caught and reflected the light, transforming damage into beauty through the alchemy of attention and care. Margaret announced her retirement from active real estate development the week before Thanksgiving, though she retained ownership of her properties to ensure that longtime tenants would never face displacement again. She hired Ethan as the estate manager, a position that allowed him to oversee her charitable foundation while pursuing his pottery in the converted studio that she insisted on expanding to accommodate public art classes. Grace's first pottery lesson took place on a snowy December afternoon, her small hands guided by Ethan's patient instruction, while Margaret watched from her armchair and offered encouragement that carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. The pottery bowl that they'd repaired using kintsugi techniques became the centerpiece of their makeshift family dinners, holding fruit or flowers depending on the season, but always catching light through its golden cracks in ways that reminded them all that healing was possible even after the most devastating breaks. Mrs. Rodriguez was among their first dinner guests, bringing homemade tamales and stories about her grandchildren that filled the estate's formal dining room with laughter that had been absent for too many years. Grace painted portraits of everyone who visited, creating a gallery of faces that transformed Margaret's house from a monument to isolation into a home that welcomed connection and forgiveness. By spring, the estate had become an unofficial community center, where local families gathered for art classes, pottery workshops, and dinners that stretched long into the evening, as people rediscovered the pleasure of unhurried conversation. Margaret moved through these gatherings with growing confidence, her reputation evolving from feared landlord to beloved neighbor as people experienced her capacity for generosity when it wasn't filtered through business calculations. She learned the names of children and grandchildren, remembered birthdays and anniversaries, and discovered that wealth meant very little without relationships to give it context and purpose. Ethan found himself thinking less about the job he'd lost and more about the life he'd gained as he watched Grace bloom in an environment where her artistic talents were celebrated and nurtured. The girl who had once moved through the world like a shadow was now teaching younger children how to mix colors and encouraging elderly students to try new techniques without fear of making mistakes. "Everyone needs to make beautiful things," she announced during one particularly successful pottery lesson, her cast-covered arm not hindering her ability to demonstrate proper clay-centering techniques with the authority of someone who'd learned to find strength in vulnerability. Margaret's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable to witness, as she shed the careful distance that had protected her from further loss and learned to embrace the messy complications of caring about other people's happiness. She established college scholarships for local students studying environmental science, created a small grant program for artists and craftspeople, and began attending Grace's school performances with the proud attention of a grandmother who'd found her family later in life than expected. The estate's gardens, which had been maintained by professional landscapers for years, became a community project where neighbors gathered on weekends to plant vegetables and flowers under Margaret's surprisingly knowledgeable guidance. The first anniversary of Grace's accident fell on a Thursday in October, marked by a small ceremony in the pottery studio, where they placed the repaired bowl on a specially built shelf near the window. The golden cracks caught the autumn sunlight and threw patterns of light and shadow across the walls, where Michael's completed pottery sat alongside new works by Grace and several community members who discovered their own artistic talents in the welcoming space. Margaret had commissioned a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of all the broken things that learned to be beautiful again," though she admitted privately that the words applied as much to people as to pottery. Grace's cast came off the week before Christmas, revealing an arm that was slightly crooked but fully functional, much like the bowl that had inspired their understanding of healing. Her first project after regaining full use of both hands was a large painting that showed the estate's gardens in spring, with flowers blooming in impossible colors and people of all ages working together to tend plants that seemed to glow with their own inner light. She presented the painting to Margaret as a Christmas gift, explaining that it showed how beautiful things could grow when people took care of each other instead of just themselves. Margaret hung Grace's painting in the estate's front hall, where visitors could see it immediately upon entering the house that had once felt like a fortress but now opened its doors to anyone who needed shelter, encouragement, or simply a place to belong. The iron gates that had once seemed forbidding now stayed open during daylight hours, welcoming neighbors who'd grown comfortable treating the estate's public spaces as their own. Children played in the gardens while their parents attended pottery classes, or simply sat in the sunroom, sharing coffee and conversation that meandered through topics both mundane and profound. On a warm evening in late May, exactly 18 months after Ethan had first driven through those intimidating gates, the three of them sat on the estate's back terrace, watching Grace demonstrate pottery techniques to a group of neighborhood children. The golden bowl sat on the table between Margaret and Ethan, filled with strawberries from the community garden that had replaced Margaret's formal rose beds. Grace's laughter carried across the lawn as she helped a 6-year-old center his first piece of clay, her patience and encouragement echoing the same gentle guidance that Margaret had shown her during those early watercolor sessions. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't taken that job?" Ethan asked, watching his daughter's animated explanation of how clay responded to gentle pressure rather than force. Margaret considered the question seriously, her fingers tracing the golden veins in Michael's repaired bowl as she thought about the butterfly effect of choices made in desperation and decisions that seemed insignificant until viewed in retrospect. "I think we would have found each other eventually," she said finally. "Broken things have a way of recognizing other broken things. Maybe it just would have taken longer." The sound of children's voices filled the evening air, mixing with the distant calls of seabirds from the harbor, and the gentle hum of activity from a house that had learned to breathe again after years of holding its breath. Grace looked up from her impromptu pottery lesson and waved at the two adults who had somehow managed to create a family from the fragments of their separate tragedy. Her wave was answered by Margaret's gentle smile and Ethan's proud nod, gestures that carried the weight of love earned through patience, forgiveness, and the slow work of rebuilding trust, one careful piece at a time. As the sun set behind the estate's ancient oak trees, casting long shadows across the lawn where children played and adults discovered that healing was possible, even after the deepest wounds, the golden bowl caught the last rays of light and scattered them like promises across the terrace. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together from the ruins of what they'd lost separately, Ethan understood that some jobs that nobody wanted turned out to be exactly what everyone needed. The best days of his life hadn't been the ones without pain, but the ones where pain had been transformed into something beautiful enough to share.